Welcome to the third Q&A episode of the At Any Cost podcast. This is the 13th of November, 2025. Hopefully all of the audio and other issues from last time have been resolved. Please let me know if not. I know that the audio, the music during the countdown there was playing mono on X. I don't know exactly why it was doing that. I'll solve that next time. It seems to be fine on YouTube, so if you experience an audio issue on X, I guess hop over to YouTube where everything seems to be fine. So no one has mentioned there are any audio issues yet, so I will assume that everything is broadcasting fine. Everything seems to be green on my end. So I will do a little bit of housekeeping before I jump into the questions. I have a handful of questions already. If some more pop up in the chat, I'll try to get to those before the end. So I'm hearing that it sounds better on YouTube. Yes, hopefully I went through and redid all of my settings in OBS, so hopefully that is much better this time. It's about as good as I can get with my current hardware. But insofar as housekeeping goes, if you want to submit questions for future episodes, future Q&As, then I linked the topic in the forum where you can go and do that. It's actually the category submit, basically one question per topic. Other people can vote on it, so that way if it winds up being a lot of questions, things can rise to the top and I can get to those more quickly, at least in theory. But that is the best way to ensure that I will see your question and that I will actually get to it. I guess I can take my headphones off since I'm not actually listening to anything on my end, so don't need those. The camera can deal with my shiny forehead. But the best way to submit the questions again is on Omnifora in that category, because that is going to be the guaranteed way that I will see them. If you submit them somewhere else, I will try to get them as well. I will try to write them down and keep them for the future. I have a list of questions here that I pulled from other places for tonight. And so without any other real housekeeping for this time, because I think that's pretty much it, I think I've covered it, I will jump right into the questions and start with sort of a serious one. I will begin with one that was actually submitted on the forum because I want to encourage that. It's easy for me because the overall goal of this is essentially to create a catalog of questions and answers so that other people can direct people in the future to my answers instead of having to answer the same question 5, 6, 7, 100 times, whatever it happens to be. The first question then. This is a bit of a two-pronged question. I am in my mid-30s and have no immediate marital prospects. This is primarily due to a hereditary genetic disorder that I have that also affects my appearance. Given the severity of it, biological children are completely out of the question. I also have occasional stumblings in sexual purity about once every 3 months or so. How would you advise in this situation? So I guess we'll be starting off with a relatively serious question then. And there are really a number of parts to this question. I think I will address the last one, as it were, first, because it's sort of the easy one to address. Not easy in the sense of dealing with the problem on the end of those who have the problem, which is going to be most of those listening, because most of the listeners are going to be male. And men in general are just going to struggle with this. We all know what the question is. And so I don't necessarily need to spell it out and get myself banned from whatever platform. But generally speaking, the best way to avoid that sort of temptation is simply to remove it as best you can. Because insofar as that temptation is concerned, and I've written an article about this and I've commented on it a couple of times, I'll put a link to that in the show notes when I put this up as a podcast episode, which I will do with high quality audio, because I am recording much higher quality audio on my end, at least as high a quality as I can do with the mic that disappears into my beard instead of the one that takes up the full screen. That'll be a podcast episode released separately. So the high quality audio will always be available after this, now that I've resolved some tech issues. But to return to the question, the best way, again, to resolve that temptation, to deal with that temptation, is to avoid it as best you can. And so that may be, if you are severely tempted by that, put your computer in a common area of your house. If you live with someone else, if you don't live with someone else, that may make it a little more challenging for you. Have an accountability partner. I know that that phrase, that term tends to make some people feel a little uneasy, but it's not a bad thing. And I do not mean a woman. Absolutely, this is not something for your wife, your girlfriend, whomever. This is something you should be sharing with a male Christian friend to keep each other accountable. That is the sort of thing that Christian brothers are supposed to do. Again, do not share this with women in your life. That is going to cause you trouble. It's going to cause her trouble. It's going to make everything worse if you do that. And women, if they're being honest with themselves, know that's the case. So put your computer in a common area as best you can. Locking down your computer is actually not going to help. And the reason that's not going to help is essentially psychology. Because psychologically, if you have to surmount an obstacle in order to achieve some goal, in order to obtain something that you want, even if in this case you kind of don't want it, but you also do. You know, it's St. Paul saying, the very thing I don't want to do is the thing that I do. But if you have that obstacle, surmounting that is going to give you a greater psychological reward. And in giving yourself a greater psychological reward, a very easily obtained one, of course, because you know how to surmount the obstacles that you put in place. That's not going to stop you. If you surmount that obstacle and get that psychological reward, it's going to reinforce that pathway and make it harder psychologically to overcome what is essentially an addiction, because it is. It's a dopamine addiction, a serotonin addiction, which is built into human physiology. I went over that in the article that I will, again, link in the notes for this, and hopefully get through and link it on all the videos as well. So the various systems that make it harder to access that content aren't necessarily going to help you. Now, they can help you in not accidentally stumbling into it, which certainly happens easily these days on social media and elsewhere, and perhaps that can be useful. But by and large, just make it more difficult in terms of not having your computer in your private space, have it in a public space, or use it only during certain hours. Cut yourself off after a certain time. It's going to require willpower, of course, but all of these things do. There's no way around that. And so have that accountability partner, make it more difficult to access these things privately, maybe limit your usage of computer, tablet, whatever it happens to be, during certain hours. And beyond that, fill your time with something productive, cardio, if you are capable of doing cardio anyway. I don't know what the health issues are in this case, but various things like that can eat up your time and help you not be distracted and not be tempted by these other things. And so to get to the next part of the question, what do we do in cases where someone has a severe genetic disorder? I don't know how severe this one is, but I'm sort of taking the abstracted case here instead of the concrete one presented. So what do you do when someone has a severe genetic disorder, but it does not preclude the libido? It doesn't preclude that desire, which is a completely natural desire. And so those who go off the rails and say that, you know, this is an evil thing, it's not part of creation. No, it's obviously part of creation. God created man and woman from the beginning. This is part of how men and women relate to one another. Granted, it's supposed to be only your spouse, but we live in a fallen world. But to answer the immediate question, how do you deal with the issue of those who would produce children who would have a severe genetic disorder? In this case, it's not as much of a problem, of course, because he's saying that children are simply out of the question. And I will assume that that's because of the genetic disorder. If it's not because of the genetic disorder, then perhaps my answer to the question, the abstracted one, is more relevant here. But I don't believe there's anything wrong with avoiding having children if you know you're going to pass something horrible on to them. I don't think that you have any requirement from God to have children and pass that to them. There's nowhere in Scripture where that's commanded. Now, it says that children are a blessing from the Lord, of course, but there's also a matter of wisdom when dealing with these issues. And so, for instance, if you knew that you had, we'll take the extreme because it's always kind of useful to start there. Take the extreme example. Say there's a 100% chance that your child is going to suffer horribly and then die 6 months after being born. You probably don't want to bring that upon a child. And so you would take measures to ensure that you do not have children. Does that necessarily mean that you can't have a wife? I think the answer is no. I think, and this is sort of the short version of the answer that everything else I've said is building up to, find a woman who cannot have children. There are plenty of those. Just quite frankly, if you marry a woman who is, say, late 30s, odds are she won't get pregnant, even if genetically, biologically, that's a possibility for the both of you. Find a woman who cannot get pregnant, who cannot have children, and live your life with her as your wife. There's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with putting yourself into a position where you know you will not have children because you have some morally valid reason to avoid having them. And so I think that's the best case here. And as you said, in your case, the genetic disorder leads to some issues with regard to your physical appearance. There are plenty of women who have those issues as well. Now, it may be that what you hear and what some will hear is, I'm telling you to settle, and perhaps that's somewhat true. That is the reality of this life. Sometimes there's going to be a requirement that certain men settle. That is just the reality of living in a fallen world. These are issues for this life. The goal is to get through this life to the next one. This one still matters, and I will never minimize how much this one matters. But these issues will not exist in paradise. And so find a woman with whom you can spend your life, whom you can love as your wife, and then make it to paradise with her, and you will both have restored and perfect bodies then. So I think that's the best answer for this, and I think that anyone who's in a similar situation, that's sort of abstract that out a level, and then that's the answer to the problem. Because if God has not given you the gift of celibacy, and basically no one has the gift of celibacy, there's probably 0 people who will ever listen to this who have been given the gift of celibacy. And if you don't have that gift, you are going to find it very difficult to attempt to remain chaste. You're not going to remain celibate because you can't be celibate unless God gives you the gift. You can be chaste. That's going to be difficult to do over a course of many years for any normal human being. If you are a man in your late teens, 20s, early 30s, it gets a little easier as you get older, of course, but if you're in that prime territory with regard to biology, it's going to be very difficult to avoid these issues if you don't have the only cure God recommends in Scripture, which is a wife. And so yes, it's difficult to find good women these days, but they do exist. And don't think that you're going to have to find a woman who's perfect, because you're not perfect, she won't be perfect, no one is perfect. We live in a fallen world. Find a woman you can love and with whom you can spend your life. That is the cure for the temptation in this case. It is the only cure God recommends, and so it is the only cure we should seek. The next question is a little bit easier, a little more lighthearted. Someone just asked what my musical tastes are, and the answer is yes, you are correct. They are rather eclectic. I do like Wagner. I do like opera. I don't have an opera company here anymore where I can go and attend the opera, but thankfully there are many places online where you can watch very good recordings, and they're quite good quality, and these headphones are actually pretty good quality, so I can do that. It's not the same as going and seeing the opera, of course, but it is nice to have the option. And the other question, sort of sub-question, was, do I like metal? I do listen to some, perhaps less than the beard would indicate, but I do listen to some metal, and like I said, my musical tastes are quite eclectic. As those who have listened to Stone Choir undoubtedly know, the intro and outro are electronica, and so yes, I've listened to some of that, I guess to be the German stereotype there, but yes, eclectic music tastes. The next question actually has 3 parts, really kind of 3 separate questions, one of which is very lighthearted again. Is there any hope for the LCMS? Is the basic question. And I think that the answer to that is it doesn't matter. And the reason that it doesn't matter is because one of the advantages to being a Protestant, of any sort of flavor of Protestant, one of the major advantages is that we don't believe that the church is a corporate identity. We don't think that the church is this physical, earthly body that has to be obeyed, has to be followed. You have to be part of this particular thing to be saved. Because that's not what the church is. The church is all believers from Adam all the way to whatever man is last standing on the earth at the end of time and is a Christian. All of those believers are the church because they are the mystical body of Christ. That is what the church is. And so, does it matter what happens to a particular corporation? The answer is, of course it matters, because it's a terrible thing to see a church body go apostate and fall apart, particularly one that used to be one of the most faithful ones on the face of the planet. Because people think that, oh, the LCMS, it was just the American Lutheranism was never a very big thing, and it had almost 3 million members at one point. I think it actually had more than that at one point, but it had about that many members. It was one of the fastest growing church bodies in the world. It was incredibly faithful. And then the World War era happened, and we all know what happens there, particularly when you have German-speaking Lutherans. And so it's terrible what has happened to the LCMS, but it does not ultimately matter if we salvage the LCMS or if we have to start up new church bodies. And I think in many cases, and I've said this to many men in DMs and elsewhere, in many cases you are going to have to start up a house church, and then from there, over time, it will grow naturally. You'll acquire a building, build it, buy it, whatever it happens to be, and you will start another church. And then those congregations will group together along doctrinal and confessional lines, and you have a new church body. There's nothing wrong with that. It is sometimes necessary. It's probably going to be necessary under current circumstances, because the odds of running a conquest of, retaking these major church bodies, fairly low odds, because the men who are in positions of power are so entrenched and so contrary to the actual Word of God, so contrary to the gospel and right doctrine, right teaching, it's probably not worth the effort, and you probably won't succeed even if you manage to expend the effort. Now, this comes with a really big caveat, because particularly for those who are from the Roman Catholic view or some other more, not magisterial, but unitary church bodies, they're not going to see it in the same way that, say, Lutherans in the U.S. would. This is, of course, not ELCA. ELCA's not even Christian, so they can go off in the corner with their pride flags. But we are Congregationalist in terms of our polity, not in terms of our theology or doctrine, but in terms of our polity, which essentially just means that the congregation typically owns the land and the building, or at least rents it, leases it, whatever it happens to be. It's not synod, it's not the corporation that owns it. Now, make sure that your constitution for your congregation has not been changed so that synod has a whole bunch of power. Make sure that doesn't happen. But by and large, the congregation owns the building. What that means is the congregation can just leave synod. The congregation can be completely faithful. You can have a faithful pastor, faithful elders, and you can just no longer be part of the LCMS. Now that works. That is perfectly viable. Taking faithful congregations out of these apostate corporate bodies and then having entire congregations join new faithful bodies, that is far preferable to having to spin up all new congregations and everything else. Much better to take the full congregation and save all of those sheep in there, because many of them have no idea what's going on. Do also bear that in mind. With regard to faithless congregations, many of the sheep may be faithful. They just have no idea what's going on. Or maybe my grandparents attended this church, my parents attended this church, I was baptized in this church, I'm going to keep attending this church. So yes, congregations can be saved, but the corporate body, probably not, and probably not worth it. And the second question, before I get to the less serious one, although as a German I can say very serious one, but you'll see why in a minute. What about worshiping with family members and friends and others who are not, in this case, Lutheran, but for whatever tradition to which you adhere, that tradition? Wells has some problems with that, and I think their doctrine is wrong on this point. They object to praying with others and things like that, but the restriction, this part I do think is right, that the LCMS has traditionally held, was that you cannot participate in a public worship service as an ordained pastor, because that is showing your tacit approval of the doctrine that we consider to be false. I think that's correct. I don't think that we should give a sign-off in any case, in any sort of way, with regard to false doctrine. But can you pray with a family member? Absolutely. I think Wells is ridiculous on that. Can you go to a worship service at a church that is not your denomination, not your tradition? I think the answer is yes. There are caveats there, of course, because we have to say, they still have to be Christian, obviously. And so if you are a traditional Lutheran, should you attend a Roman Catholic Mass? The answer is probably no, because we consider their conception of the sacrifice of the Mass to be abominable. So you probably should not attend that. But can you go to a Baptist service? Sure. You're going to severely object, of course, if they start talking about the real presence because they don't believe in it. But the only sort of limitation would be do not participate in the Lord's Supper if it is offered. At a Baptist church, it probably won't be. And even if it is, it's not the real thing because they don't use wine and they don't believe. So do not participate in that because you have to be in unity with your brothers doctrinally, confessionally, if you are participating in the meal that is that show of unity. And so don't partake of the sacrament at a church with which you do not believe you disagree with their doctrine. Don't do that. But can you worship with them? Absolutely. Can you pray with them? You absolutely should. So there's nothing wrong with that. And then the third question, the less serious one or extremely serious one, depending how you view things, is what is my favorite beer? And I would say that my favorite beers would be any of the dark ones from Weihenstephaner. That's probably my favorite brewery. It used to be, when I lived in Berlin, it was basically only a handful of tram stops away from my apartment. Their Berlin location, obviously not the main one down in Bavaria, but I used to go and have lunch there and go to the museums because the museum island, all the museums are sort of grouped together in Berlin with some satellite ones, but I used to go there and then go to the island and wander around the museums because it was a very short walk. It was very nice. So that's my favorite beer, a little tidbit about my previous life, I guess it will be. Just a quick question here about whether or not I'm still practicing law. The answer to that is yes and no. Yes, I am still a licensed attorney. Surprisingly, the bar has not opened an investigation into me. I know they're going to eventually do that. They've sort of been building up to it to sort of excise, particularly in California, excise anyone with so-called far-right views. I can see where the trajectory is going. I know exactly the tactic they're going to take. They're not very subtle. They're not very bright either, but we'll see how that goes. I probably won't be the first attorney in California who'll be brought up on charges for being racist or whatever it happens to be, but they will, I know exactly what they'll do. And I may as well say what they're going to do. Not how they'll build up to it, but the way that they will enforce it. And the way that they enforce it is this. They don't say that, oh, you are a racist and so we're going to kick you out. What they will say is that showing this form of racial discrimination in your online behavior, whatever it happens to be, whatever argument they use, is contrary to the ethics rules with regard to impartiality in representation or something similar to that. And so we are going to fine you $50,000. And if you don't pay the fine, you can't keep your license. And so your options, of course, then are, well, fight this $50,000 fine and probably spend a great deal of money doing so and have to fly back to California, incidentally, in my case, or pay the $50,000 and then they will probably fine you again unless you delete your entire online presence and give up doing the sort of things that I do. And so that's probably coming down the pipeline. Perhaps I'll get a Tennessee bar card instead and give up my California one. I kind of like having the California one. It's my only tie left to California. I deliberately severed everything else because I didn't want them to try to tax me because it's California. But yes, I'm still a licensed attorney and I do practice law to some degree, but it is not exactly beneficial to have my notoriety with regard to practicing law, as you might imagine. Except, of course, if you're practicing the sort of law where that benefits, which I'm not. I'm an expert technically in antitrust or competition law, as they call it in the EU. And not necessarily beneficial to have my reputation because of Stone Choir and other things and practice law. So yes and no, sort of the answer. And the next question is a theology question. And it is, what would be my argument against annihilationism? And I've answered this one a number of times. Before I get into it, I'm going to drink a little bit of tea here. So the answer with regard to annihilationism is that you cannot have annihilationism because the destruction of that which is good is itself evil. Now, that's a philosophical argument and perhaps somewhat of a high-level one, but I'll break down what that means. With regard to, I guess we'll go with existence of anything, you have the transcendentals. There are things that are good in and of themselves. The transcendentals are convertible, which means that goodness, beauty, and truth, goodness is beauty, beauty is truth, truth is goodness. So human beings existing is good, partly because being is good, being and unity being the fourth and fifth transcendentals, but being is good because it is a thing with regard to humanity that is created by God. Everything God creates is good. And so the destruction of anything that is good is necessarily evil. So if God were to destroy a human being in terms of annihilationism, that would be evil. And God cannot commit evil because God is good. God is good, God is goodness. And so God actually cannot destroy humanity in terms of annihilating a soul, in terms of annihilating a human being. And now I know there are those who will say, well, you just said God cannot. I'm speaking in human terms because if you try to explain these things in terms that are perfectly accurate, you wind up having to circumlocute and just in crazy ways, trying to explain this in a way that's absolutely perfectly accurate and technically correct. Because what I'm really saying is that it's incoherent. You can't say God did X and X is evil, because God doesn't do anything evil. Everything God does is good. God is good. God is goodness. And so when I say that God cannot do something that is evil, what I'm saying really is that it's incoherent to assert of God having done or going to do that which is evil. So annihilationism is philosophically incoherent because it accuses God of planning to do that which is evil. And then he wouldn't be God, because God is his nature. Part of his nature, of course, and of course I'm speaking in parts because, again, speaking in a human manner, would be the transcendentals, goodness, beauty, truth. And so annihilationism is false because it is morally, philosophically, logically incoherent. It just appeals to people. This is sort of stepping back from the philosophical bit of it, but it appeals to people because it sounds nicer to say that you simply, I won't snap because that's a bad thing to do when you're wearing a mic, but it's not, it seems nicer to say that you just disappear, you're just gone. That's just the end of it, instead of you suffer for eternity in hell. And to us, it certainly sounds on the surface, until you again delve into that philosophy, it sounds better to simply cease to exist than to suffer for eternity. But it is actually worse because it is an evil to destroy something that is good. Now, of course, it's better if people actually convert and believe in Christ and spend eternity in paradise instead of spending eternity in hell. But annihilationism is false for the reasons laid out. But I understand why it is appealing to some people, particularly because if you have, for instance, loved ones who have died and they did not believe, you know they did not believe, in fact, maybe they hated God, it's much more comforting to some degree on a surface level to say that they were destroyed instead of saying that they are in hell. But that is the reality of it, that hell is eternal. Hell is the fire that does not consume. I think I have gone over most of the questions now that I had written down. I think there were a couple of questions in the chat, so I will get to those. What are your thoughts on the Church of Christ denomination? I do not have any particular thoughts on that denomination. I would have to look into their distinctives again. I have not looked at them in many years, so I do not remember exactly what it is that they hold. I will look into that and get to that next week. So the next one, what is the biblical or wise way to get to the point of Christian white nationalism? What are some practical things we can do? insofar as the ideology is concerned, we already laid that out with Stone Choir. Now, there are some things that we did not address, of course, with regard to the purely political, because that's a different thing. That's not the enterprise that we were undertaking with Stone Choir. And so we addressed the theology, we addressed the doctrine, all the practical parts of that. And I have an article that I have partially written on this, and I need to get around to finishing that and publishing it. But insofar as the next steps are concerned, the next steps are political. Yes, we need to continue doing the things on the theology, the doctrinal front, getting men to believe in the truth, getting men to work together, getting men to form new congregations, or remove faithful congregations from faithless corporate bodies, as gone over in a previous answer to a previous question. But at this point, we really are in the politics or bust. That's the only way forward. And I do mean politics in sort of the Schmittian sense, in the more realpolitik sense, not in the sense of necessarily simply electoral politics, because electoral politics is simply a subset of politics. It is not the fullness of it. And so the way forward is things that are indeed very concrete. It is the only way we are going to actually accomplish anything. It is the only way we are going to get anything done. And part of that, of course, is going to be forming actual political groups and engaging in politics. Now, I can't go into all of the details of what all of these things are going to require for fairly obvious reasons to most men. But the years ahead are going to be difficult. There is no way around that. There is no ignoring that fact. We have no choice. It is our duty to do these things, and God has the outcome in His hands. I've been very clear about that all throughout, from the very beginning when I started to be more public with my views on social media, all through Stone Choir. The duty is ours, the outcome is God's. So we don't have to fear what is going to happen. We don't have to fear what is going to happen to us or with regard to our nation, our people, anything like that. God has made promises to us, and He will be faithful. He will be true. It is simply our duty to do our duty, to do the things set before us that we are capable of doing and that God has given us to do. And so, what are the practical things we can do? Work together, support each other, be there for your brothers when they need you, because there are going to be men who are going to suffer heavier costs than others, and they need to have a support network there for them. We need to stop acting like individuals and act like we are actually in this together. We are a group, not individuals. We are a race, we are a nation, and we need to support each other. Because if we don't do that, then quite frankly, we deserve to lose. Because the group that acts like a group, that recognizes it is a group, recognizes it is a collective, is going to be the one that succeeds. I want that to be us. What version of the Bible would you recommend I read? Is the NIV okay? The current answer to that is basically just read whatever version you have. There are plenty of good modern ones in English with regard to the New Testament. With regard to the Old Testament, they're basically all based on the Masoretic, and so go see the series that we did for Stone Choir on the Septuagint. But there are translations of the Septuagint into English. They're more or less good. They have various problems. The Lexham, for instance, is very stilted in some places because it's sort of academic. The Nets is also a little bit stilted in some places because they're extremely literal, to the point where some of the name translations are pretty funny because they're just so ridiculous. I can't even think of some of the best ones because they're just so crazy that I don't have them memorized. It's fine to read. It's accurate. It's faithful to the underlying Greek, but it's not a very good English translation because that wasn't the purpose. That one was meant to be for study, so that's fine. The Brenton is antiquated because it's sort of the KJV, the original KJV version of the translation of the Septuagint into English. So they all have some problems. We have some other ones in the pipeline. Hopefully some of those will be very good. Eventually we will have a definitive answer. This is the English translation of the Septuagint. Read this. But insofar as the New Testament is concerned, plenty of great options. NASB, NIV is fine. It's not my favorite. It's not bad. ASV, ESV, all sorts of options. Pick the one that you like. Pick the one that you have. Read it. The best thing you can do is read it. I typically am reading the ESV. It just happens to be the one that I have probably too many copies of, but for the daily devotions, for the Through the Bible series, I read the ESV. Next year, I will switch to some translation. Hopefully, there's a good one by then, or I'm going to have to do some edits, which is going to make it a lot longer for me to record every day, but I'm going to switch to reading a translation of the Septuagint for the Old Testament portion. I'll probably keep reading the ESV for the New Testament because it's fine. I make some edits on the fly mentally when I'm going through it because, for instance, the word Gentiles should not be used because that's weird. We just kept a Latin word around because it's Judaizing, that's the reason. But the word means either heathen or nations, depending on the context. And seeing as I just said both of those words, we have them in English. It should have been translated. It should not have been left in the Latin. Luther didn't leave it in the Latin when he translated into German. When he translated from the Greek into the German, he didn't randomly translate into Latin instead. He used the German words for heathen and nation, which is what we should be doing in English. And some minor things like that. If I got a full ride scholarship, should I continue to go to college? Also follow up, what are your recommendations for someone possibly seeking ordination? Should I keep this stuff under wraps or what? I'll answer the second one first. It is going to depend partly on the church body in which you are seeking ordination, but the general answer is yes. You should hide your power level, as it were, because they are going to persecute you, they are going to drive you from the church, and they're going to try to destroy your life, if they can, if they figure out what you actually believe. Because most of the church corporations, the large bodies, are run by evil men, and they want to do evil things. So, if you are pursuing ordination in one of those bodies, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, because in some cases, some of the seminary classes, not all, there are bad professors certainly, some very bad professors in some traditions, in some seminaries. Some of them are still good. And so you may very well get a worthwhile education. Is it necessarily worth your time, probably money, in order to go to seminary? Maybe not. You can do a lot of that studying on your own. There are plenty of good resources. You can go and basically be tutored by a very good pastor, if you can find a good pastor. There are still good pastors out there. That's probably, so the apprenticeship route, basically. That might be better at this point. And I'm saying that as a Lutheran, where traditionally we've been very big on seminary and the whole proper ordination, all that sort of thing, but that's not necessarily a requirement to be a properly ordained pastor, a properly trained, fit for the office pastor. That may not be the best route these days. If you happen to get into a seminary that is in your tradition, that you know has some faithful pastors at least, some faithful professors, you can befriend them and learn from them, and it's not going to cost you a bunch of money, or money's not an object for you, which you said you had a scholarship, so I assume that money is an object. Sure, pursue that. It's probably worth it. Insofar as college is concerned, if you have a full ride, absolutely continue to pursue that. It is worth having that degree. Just, hide your power level, get through. Your goal is to get through, get the degree, and get a good job, right? That's your goal. And there's nothing wrong with that. I have never been one to tell men avoid college. Now, too many men go to college, certainly, but those who have been given the intellectual gifts by God to do that sort of thing, and college used to be exceptional. It used to be only the very upper echelons went to college. Certainly university, if you want to draw that sort of distinction, the hierarchical distinction. If you have been given those gifts, if you have those capabilities, then absolutely you should go to university. It is still a worthwhile thing. Again, you can still find good professors. Granted, in my case, it's been a number of years now because, I graduated in 2008, but there were still very good professors. There still are good professors. I'm friends with some people, some men who are good professors at universities. I'm, of course, not going to name them because the last thing they want is that. But you can find that, and you can find advantages there. It can be beneficial. It can be a good thing to go to university. Just again, hide your power level. Probably don't cause too many trouble, too many problems, too much trouble for yourself before you graduate. At least before you graduate. Looks like someone submitted a question on Omnifora, but wasn't sure it's in the right place. If it was submitted recently, as in the last few hours, I have not checked, so I may not have seen it. Or it may be in a category where I didn't find it. I'll move it if it happens to be somewhere that it probably shouldn't be. In our modern age of usury, cryptocurrency, 50-year mortgages, and global banking schemes, how would you recommend being a good financial steward? This is a difficult one. And I had another question that was related to that. It was with regard to savings and things like that. So these are sort of two related questions. I'll answer them together. What do you do financially, given that we live under a system that is openly and actively evil and getting worse? That's a hard question, and there is no good answer. There are answers, and I can give you a sort of general answer, a general approach. It's a question of wisdom ultimately. It is a question of what do you do with the resources that God has given you, because you are a steward of those resources. God expects you to use them wisely. This is the parable of the talents and a number of other things as well, but that one primarily. What do you do with the financial resources God has given you? And the answer is that you use them, of course, wisely, and you use them in the best possible way you can. I would say avoid engaging in some of these things that are just extreme in terms of their wickedness. You can't avoid it. You can't avoid all of it. Because, of course, if you use a credit card, right? Well, credit cards exist on the back of usury, on the back of those who do not pay off their balances. And by the way, pay off your balance every month if by any means you can. But they exist off the backs of those who cannot pay their balances every month and therefore pay interest charges. And so when I use my credit card, I am engaging in a system that is based on wickedness at its core. But I don't have a choice in this day and age, because many places you could never even buy things if you don't use a credit card. And I know that some are going to be thinking, well, doesn't that sound like the mark of the beast? And it sounds like it a little bit, yes. I don't think credit cards are the mark of the beast, I want to be clear. And so I don't think that as a Christian living in this system, you are categorically prohibited from using things like that. So I don't think you're prohibited from having a savings account or investments and things like that. You have to engage with the world as you find it with wisdom. And so avoid the things that trouble your conscience. That's one of the general rules. That's just a blanket rule across the board for everything. Avoid the things that trouble your conscience. Can you use the financial instruments and vehicles that our system has in clean conscience as a Christian? I think the answer is yes. I think that it comes with a caveat that you should still want to change the system. You should never buy into it to the point where, well, I'm so heavily invested in the system now, I can't possibly say that we should change this. And so, for instance, don't be the kind of person who looks at student loan forgiveness and says, well, if they do that, it's going to hurt my 401k or whatever it happens to be. Don't be that man. Can you use the system? Yes. Should you want to change the system? Yes. It is a wisdom call. You have to do the best that you can with the resources entrusted to your care and the people entrusted to your care. Because, of course, if you just go out there and are a complete fool with your money and don't use any of the financial instruments, don't take advantage of any of these sorts of programs and offers and all these things, and you say that I'm just being a perfectly moral man, and you wind up driving your family to poverty, you go bankrupt and they're starving on the streets. Have you actually accomplished anything? The answer is no. Sometimes there are no good options. And I think when it comes to this sort of thing, there is no, this is the definitive good answer. I think it is do the best you can with the measure of wisdom that God has given you. Can you imagine a scenario where, I have to scroll so my camera is not blocking, a large portion of the public is able to break programming and see that we have been massively lied to about World War II and the, I will say, National Socialists, but he has evil Nazis in quotation marks. I think that the average person just sort of goes along with whatever he's told. Talk to someone who watches a lot of news programs and you will simply hear CNN, Fox News, MSNBC secondhand or thirdhand, whatever it happens to be. So I don't think that the average person is really doing much in terms of processing when it comes to this stuff. So the question then is, sort of stepping back a couple paces, how do you change those views with regard to that standard narrative? Well, you have to change the system. You have to change the education system. You have to have political control. And so, is it worth talking to those in your personal life about that? It's a wisdom call. Sometimes the best answer I can give you sort of sounds like the Weasley attorney answer, it depends, but it does. It's a wisdom call. Because as you full well know, there are those in your life who will be open to discussing these topics and those who will absolutely not be. Those who will cut you out of their life and call you evil and probably try to get you fired. So there's wisdom involved. Do I think that we can have a mass awakening? I don't think that there's really going to be a mass awakening where people just suddenly recognize that, oh, well, this was false and I was lied to, because the evidence is all there. Anyone who's inclined to actually look at the evidence and examine the facts arrives at the conclusion that all this stuff is a lie. It's very straightforward. It's very simple to follow. Even for those who know nothing about, chemistry and cyanide gas and Prussian blue and all these things, even those who know nothing about that stuff, it's not that hard to follow. It's not that hard to figure it out. Use a calculator and some very simple division. So most men are not going to figure that out. They're not going to do it on their own. If you had a leader who rose to a position of prominence and started questioning that stuff publicly, absolutely, you would have men who'd followed him. So I don't think it's a question of sort of mass awakening or the public suddenly deciding to change what it believes. I think it's a matter of leadership. And it's largely in line with my general view of history. I believe in the great man theory. I believe that that is just how history works out. That's how God has built the system, because there's the hierarchy. And so the man at the top determines a lot. It's one of the reasons that I am so disappointed in our current leadership, because the opportunities that have been squandered would be difficult to overstate. Sort of the general answer to that question. So it's a leadership question, like so many other things. I see we have some people saying I should debate Sam Shamoon. I have absolutely no idea who that is. So, sure. Yeah, I have literally no idea who that is. So I don't see any other questions here. I think that may be the end of the questions for this week, unless there are any questions that pop up in chat in the next minute or two. I will quickly tab over and look at a couple other places where questions have been submitted, assuming that my notifications will load. Looks like I mostly have people asking me questions about the picture of a pizza that I posted earlier. So I think that is probably the end of the questions for this week, since I am not intending on starting up a cooking show. I don't think that anyone would necessarily want to watch that anyway, because my measurements are usually do what feels right, and that is not very helpful to most other men. So let's see. I don't see any other questions, so I think that that is the end for this week. If you have any questions, again, please submit those via the forum link that I provided earlier. I will put that in the show notes, of course, when I release the episode, and I will put that in the various places across the handful of platforms. I guess it's now 5 platforms to which I'm streaming, assuming that the streams are still working. And so I will put in that URL so you can go and submit those questions. Please use that because it's the best way for me to track it. Yes, there is a $10 account creation fee, and the reason that I did that, I meant to address this at the beginning, but I want to address it now before I close this out. The reason that I did that, it's the only way that I can avoid spam. It's literally the only way that I can do it without investing an enormous amount of my time or finding someone willing to moderate it. And I don't have anyone who's willing to, at least I haven't found anyone yet, who's willing to do that sort of moderation. And if you have a $10 fee, it means that most people will not be willing to make a bunch of new accounts to cause trouble. Now, there are people who hate me enough to spend $200, $300, $400 to just annoy me and waste my time, but not that many of them. Enough of them that the account creation fee basically avoids the problem. The other half of that is that I never want to make this or anything else I do into a matter of pay the fee, get the answer, or whatever it happens to be. It's not going to be super chats or whatever they're called on these various other platforms. If you stand up and say, I'm a theologian, if you stand up and say that people should listen to you on theological, doctrinal, religious, other issues like that, you don't get to charge for your answers and your time. Now, I know that that flies in the face of capitalism and everything else that, oh, you don't get to charge for your time. No, you don't. Because if God has given you certain abilities, it is your duty to use those. And with regard to things like this, I have no right to charge for this. It's one of the reasons that I'm doing it, because I don't have a right not to answer these questions. And so I will continue to answer them. And I will not make it a matter of, oh, I have someone who gave me $50, I'll answer his question. I'm not going to do that. I want people to use the forum because it helps me to organize the questions and the answers. It helps me to be able to point back to them. And it also helps so that I have a central repository of them that I control, so that I don't rely on some third-party platform that may deplatform me or delete things or just they magically disappear, whatever it happens to be. That's the reason that I've set it up in that way, because it's the best way I could find to do it, to avoid the spam problem and also make it so that I'm not just saying, oh, well, pay me and I'll answer your questions. That's not what this is going to be. I will never be charging for any of this stuff. As I've said all along, all of the content I produce will be free. All the podcasts I produce will be free. If I write a book, I will give away the PDF. All of my articles are on my site for free. There will never be a paywall. I will never do any of that stuff, regardless of what it costs me and regardless of what I could be paid to do it. We didn't go into Stone Choir and think, oh, well, the opportunity cost of Stone Choir is thousands of hours times an hourly rate with... No, that's not it. That's not what this is, and it's not what it will ever be. So please do submit them on the forum, simply because it is the best way that I have found in order to organize this and avoid all of the many problems of which we're all very aware on the internet. So I don't see anything else, any last minute questions there, mostly just some, I will say, not the most useful comments right now about, again, the man whom I don't know. So I don't know who he is. I can't say I'll debate him because I don't know him. So I guess I'll be looking up that name as soon as I close this out. But I believe that's all for this week. So thank you for those of you who attended. Thank you for those of you who submitted questions. Again, please submit questions for next week. And if there were any problems with the audio, video, whatever it happens to be, please let me know. I can be contacted, of course, my Telegram channel. I'm on X, at least until I get banned again, because that might happen. But I can be contacted in any of a number of different ways. So thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great evening. God bless you all.